Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we take a closer look at the top political stories of the day. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Paulet, and thanks for being with us. Robin Vos is the Speaker of the Wisconsin Assembly, the longest-serving speaker in its history. But the Republican, who represents part of Wisconsin's Racine County, has been the subject of 2 recall efforts already this year.
He is the most powerful Republican in state government. Now, Speaker Robin Vos is one step closer to a recall, and it's brought by voters who support former President Donald Trump.
Recall Vos! Recall Vos!
This group still upset over 2020. Vos's now public criticism of former President Donald Trump and his unwillingness to impeach Wisconsin's top elections chief, Megan Wolf.
Vos's recall stemmed from fellow Republicans upset by his refusal to impeach the election officials who certified the votes confirming President Joe Biden's victory in the state in 2020.
It is a small, very loud, vocal group of people who are just misguided and don't understand that we need to focus on winning elections in the future, not focus on the ones in the past.
But Vos is just one of many elected officials facing recall efforts for a variety of reasons. The first half of 2024 has seen more recall attempts in the first half of any other year since Ballotpedia has been tracking this information since 2009. I'm Jeff Paulet, and today on the Ballot with Ballotpedia, we're speaking with Abby Smith, staff writer at Ballotpedia, about these recall efforts and what they mean about our current state of politics. Abby, good to see you. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm always excited to talk about recalls.
I know, me too, right? Okay, so let's start with the basics, right? Because not everybody even knows or understands what recalls are. They're a really interesting nuance in American politics. So what is a political recall?
Sure. So a political recall is a process that allows citizens to remove elected officials from their positions before the end of their term. So it's a process that requires a petition and signatures from other citizens. If enough signatures are collected, a recall election is usually held. I say usually because of Virginia. That state actually goes to the courts if they have enough signatures. But everyone else uses a recall election. And then if an election is held, voters get to choose on the ballot whether they're keeping that official in office. And that can look like a simple, do you want to keep XYZ in office? And they get to vote yes or no. Or sometimes it's more of a redo election where that incumbent who has been recalled runs against other candidates. And then the voters get to choose who they want to be in office. Yeah.
And most people, I think, if you ask them, would say they remember, recalls. That's how Arnold Schwarzenegger became governor, right? There was a recall, and that's how he became governor. But the reality is not every state actually allows recalls. So how many states allow recalls at all?
Sure. 39. So it actually is a majority, do allow some sort of recall. And it can totally vary by office type there. But 39 states do allow recalls at the local level of some sort. And then 19 of those do allow recalls at the state level. No federal recalls are allowed, though.
Yeah. So, recalls are a really interesting part of our political process. And what do you find makes them the most interesting to you? I mean, they're one of the least followed aspects. I think in part because so many of them are really small towns, are very local. They're very rarely situations like the governor of Wisconsin or the governor of California being recalled. Most of them are really small towns. But what do you find makes them most interesting, since you've been covering that for quite a long time for us?
Yeah. So I personally find recalls fascinating. They're one of the few ways people have to directly impact their government outside of just, regular voting. Ballot measures also do this by allowing citizens to kind of vote on an individual law rather than having kind of that barrier that you have with a representative deciding on laws for you. With a ballot measure, you get to decide on that law yourself. It's similar with recalls, but instead of a law, you're looking at an office holder and you get to decide whether or not they should finish their term for, whatever reason that recall got started. So they don't have to wait until the end. They can, take them out of office sooner if they desire.
And the different rules are out there for why and how you can start a recall. I mean, some of the states, right, you have to have a very specific reason and cause. You can't just say, okay, well, we know we elected this person 2 years ago, but you know what? We don't want them to finish their term. So recall. In some states, there are very specific requirements for the rules, right? And in other states, it's a little looser and broader.
Mm-hmm. It varies a lot.
What do you notice when you do coverage like that?
Yeah, so the starting a recall, you're going to see some states have a lot more that we can track because it's really easy to start one. But then you'll see other states where it's actually easier for that person to get to the ballot. The recall actually ends up on the ballot because maybe the signature threshold is a lot lower in that state. So it really varies. You'll see, we'll talk later on about California, Michigan. We got a lot of recalls from them, but it's relatively easy to get on the ballot there. Or not get on the ballot, but get started, get that paperwork, that first step.
Yeah, it's such an interesting blend of our political system because you're right. You said it earlier. It's like a combination of a ballot measure and a regular election, all kind of wrapped up in one, with similar elements to that. So let's stick to kind of the meat of things. So we've been covering recalls for more than a decade now, and we publish 2 reports each year, a mid-year report and then an end-of-year report. So we just published our mid-year report earlier this month. Well, actually, we're recording this on July 30th, so earlier this month, but this episode will come out in August. So let's say last month, we published our mid-year report, and we saw some pretty interesting things in that. In particular, what we noticed is that there have been more successful recalls at this point than in any other mid-year report we published. So were you surprised at that? And what have we noticed when we got into that data?
Yeah, it was super fascinating fact to find out. We actually had a couple of last minute recalls that we discovered. So that tracking was kind of very end of our report. We're like, whoa, wait, we have the most successful. That's really cool. So actually, as of today, we're up to 43 officials recalled this year. So that number is growing after just about a month since we've published. And we've got another 2 recall elections happening this week. So that number could go up more again. But yeah, when looking at raw numbers, the next highest was 29 officials successfully recalled in June 2016. And one thing that makes this even more interesting is that we also tracked the most officials targeted for recall at the mid-year point this year than we've ever tracked before. So a total of 266 officials targeted for recall so far this year. So there were more recalls, but then there were also more recalls that were successful.
Yeah, so it's not just the conversion rate, right? I mean, it might have been, if you're shooting a bunch of 3-pointers, well, are you converting more of them? It sounds like it's both. It's there are more shots being taken, more recalls out there. And one thing I was wondering, I don't know if you had a chance to look into this, Abby, yet, but recalls, unlike your standard elections, are on their own calendar and clock. They're all just based on when the paperwork is filed. So one thing I've always kind of wondered is, are they ever going to sort of, backlog in a way where we had a bunch of recalls started at the end of, say, 2023, and it just so happened that they coincided to taking place in the early part of 2024 because they're staggered. There's no calendar. It's not like your standard midterm and presidential year elections. It's just literally when people decide to file the paperwork. And is it possible that part of it was just the coincidence of timing? What do you think about that?
Yes, I do think it probably did play into that. I don't have the numbers in front of me of how many January, February recalls we had, which would have definitely been started in 2023. But yes, I do think that played in a little bit to those numbers.
Yeah, and COVID was a really big impact on recall. So how did the COVID pandemic from 2020, 2022, how did that impact the state of recalls?
So the highest number of recalls we've ever tracked for a full year happened in 2021. And then the second highest was 2022. And the third was 2023. So we're kind of on track. We've seen a lot of recalls the last couple of years. And 2021 and 2022 were definitely impacted by COVID. 40% of recalls in 2021 were COVID related. And then 21% were COVID related in 2022. So if the pandemic had not happened, those numbers would not have been so high. But they were that high, and the media covered them. People heard from other friends in other towns about recalls happening. So there's just a little bit more information, I think, out there right now about recalls. There's information sharing going on as well. I've covered a couple different school board recalls where they, on their recall campaign pages, they were thanking another group in a different school district who had shared all the information that they got about how to get a recall on the ballot. So part of the numbers being high, I think, is just a general higher information availability.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting time because not to over stereotype, but for a long time, I'd say the mid 2010s, let's say, a fair number of recalls always seemed anecdotally to be things like, okay, here's a political figure who committed a crime while in office, and it's not a crime that you can actually expel them for, so let's recall this person. Or they did something kind of inappropriate at work and they're not going to get fired for it. Let's recall them. So they were usually reserved for things that were kind of obscure, I guess you might say. What seems to have been really interesting is that the education environment has changed. And now what we've seen over the last 3-4 years are things like, let's recall this school board member because we don't like the fact that they instituted masks in our district. Or you've seen the opposite. Let's recall the school board member because they voted against instituting masks in this district. Or you see the same thing with, say, education policy. We don't like the school board member because they tried to ban books. Or we don't like this board member because they voted not to ban certain bad books that we don't like. So you're seeing like all across the spectrum, people using the recall, and it's not just sort of a one-sided tactic anymore. Am I over stereotyping, or what have you seen? You're in the weeds covering. I'm just reading your article. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, I would say there's definitely reasons that have always been around and haven't gone away. So for a school board recall, when a superintendent is fired and it was like kind of a beloved superintendent, that's a really like I'm expecting a recall effort to happen there. That still happens. COVID didn't change that. That's a pretty common issue. But yeah, I would say like curriculum decisions, book bannings, those are newer that I've seen in the last 2 years or so. COVID-related reasons with masks and stuff, that was definitely big in 2021, 2022. But those have kind of fallen away now. And actually right now I'm seeing a lot more, and again, my expertise is school boards. So there's plenty of other different reasons for city councilors, et cetera. But for me with school boards, I'm seeing kind of like school closings and budget issues as school districts are dealing with like lower enrollment numbers and have to make some difficult decisions. Those are becoming a little more.
Yeah, well, the ESSER funding cliff is coming where for those, in a nutshell, and that's a whole different episode, would be at the ESSER funding issue. When a lot of the national bills are passed the last few years to provide extra funding to school districts, that funding is not permanent. That funding goes away in the next couple of years. And what are school districts going to do once they lose that federal funding? Did they do one-time only spending, in which case, they won't have a budget issue, or did they hire a bunch of full-time positions that they are now not funded? So that is creating a lot of very interesting school district stories. But yeah, let's kind of circle back to this year. Is there anything else that you've noticed with respect to the higher rate of recalls this year that stood out to you when we put this report together?
Sure. So I mentioned earlier when looking at midpoint numbers, June 2016 had the second highest raw number of officials recalled. And that same June 2016 also had the second highest number of officials targeted for recall with 265. So that's one less than we have for 2024. Looking at percentages then, June 2019 was actually the highest with percentages. It just squeaked past 2024 with 14.8% of officials included in recall efforts getting removed. This year's was 14.3%, so 0.5 difference there. Caveat for June 2019 is that they actually had the lowest number we ever tracked. So their 17 officials who were recalled would not have been such a high percentage in a different year. They had a much lower number to start with. And then on the other side, the lowest number of officials that were successfully recalled by the mid-year point was 9. We saw that number in 2015 and 2021. So that surge of COVID-related recalls that I mentioned earlier in 2021, they actually weren't very successful. The percentage that year of officials getting removed by recall was 3.4%. And then just to give you some context to those numbers, if you aggregate all the recalls that we've covered since 2014, that's when we started publishing these reports, the average success rate is 9.3. So this year's is definitely higher than that. And then the average raw number of officials removed from office is 19.
Yeah. So yeah, we're seeing, more recalls and more successful recalls, which kind of implies that the individuals and the organizations or committees that are behind recall attempts, maybe they're being a little bit more organized or coordinated than they maybe were in years past. So that's really interesting. Yeah. What other themes are you seeing when you and the team compile all of your sort of raw data together? What does it look like?
Yeah. So when I talked to my coworkers about this on the recall team, and so kind of looking at all different office types. Public safety has been a big one. Character conduct of an official, that one's just kind of tried and true, always going to be there for recalls. Access to services, budget issues, school closures, hiring or firing decisions, zoning issues, and then support or opposition for specific legislation are kind of the main ones we've been seeing this year.
Yeah. So let's get back to, you were talking about the states that are most common for recall. So Michigan, California, and Oregon, those have had the most recall efforts. And that's not uncommon to see, but some of the states did have a particularly noticeable jump this year compared to prior years, even among the common states. So what have we seen in terms of the states that saw the biggest increase so far this year?
Oh, I'm sorry. I do not have that data.
Oh, that's good. We're just going to pull the report up then right now. Because there were 2 or 3 states that stood out when we put that last table together.
Oh, the last table. Okay.
That Frank will pull up and he'll display it on the video. And it showed that it was actually just a handful of states were contributing to the big increase this year. It wasn't really like an across the board thing. There were some states that were seeing a bigger jump than usual.
Texas and looks like Wisconsin were definitely saw a surge this year compared to what they've seen before.
Yeah, that's interesting. And mostly at the city council level, right? Because that's actually where we've kind of returned to the sort of old tried and true, which is that pre-2020 city councils are the most common form for recalls, which is probably just a mixture of, ease of collecting signatures and notability and awareness of the position. I can't imagine there are very many coroner recalls that happen. So
no, I have covered them though.
Yeah, very interesting. Also, there are quirky ones out there. But yeah, it's let's go back a little bit into what is it about like Michigan, California, and Oregon that makes them the most common and prominent place for recalls?
Sure. So part of it, just which states have common recalls. It really kind of looks at their culture and then also their recall laws. California, for example, has a long history of supporting direct democracy efforts. So the state tends to see a lot of ballot measures alongside a lot of recalls. California and Michigan have been in the top spot for years now for looking at recalls specifically. In the past 8 years, California has been in the top 5 times and Michigan 3. Both states have laws that make it relatively easy to start a recall. So in Michigan, anyone can create a petition and turn it into their county clerk. So that's kind of like a one-person deal. You don't have to get a whole group of people yet. You can start that effort. And that's when we start counting recalls at Ballotpedia. We start tracking when any kind of official paperwork has been started. And then California, you only need a handful of signatures to start a notice of intent to recall, which, again, is not a full petition yet. So those numbers are going to be high just because that first starting point where we start tracking is relatively easy compared to other states.
In some respects, and it's kind of semantics, but that's the system as it plays out. It's a true example of the United States political system and federalism in the 50 states, and they all have different approaches to recalls. So let's talk about some of the major recalls we've seen so far this year. So, people will remember Schwarzenegger recall in 2003 with Governor Gray Davis. Then there were a number of really prominent Wisconsin State Senate recalls in 2011. Governor Scott Walker went through recalls a couple of different times. Governor Newsom went through a recent recall. There were some pretty big DA recalls in San Francisco in the last few years. So what are some of the more prominent sort of nationally recognized recalls that we're seeing so far this year?
So the first one that comes to mind is probably Robin Voss in Wisconsin, Speaker of the State Assembly. He had 2 different efforts started against him this year. And it was actually by members of the Republican Party, which is his party. And so, for his response to that recall effort, he said the leaders of the effort were actually involved in his 2022 campaign for his primary opponent. So, he defeated that opponent with 51.3% of the vote. And then that opponent actually went back onto the general election ballot as a write-in. So his response to this recall was the effort today is no surprise since the people involved cannot seem to get over any election in which their preferred candidate doesn't win. And that's a quote from him. So this is actually a really interesting one when looking at recall laws and kind of the really integral, tiny details that really matter when you're going to get something on a ballot. So neither of the efforts actually made the ballot. The first one started in January, and they just didn't have enough signatures by the March filing deadline. And then they started again, and they had a deadline of May 28th. So they submitted the signatures this time, and staff at the Wisconsin Elections Commission initially verified enough signatures to put it on the ballot. The members of the Election Commission then met and found the petition was insufficient. The vote for that was 4-2 on that decision. The issue was that the deadline to turn in the petitions within the 60-day window, and that's just a Wisconsin law. Everybody gets 60 days when it comes to a recall. That fell on a Sunday. And then the next day was Memorial Day. So they actually could turn it in, their petitions, on Tuesday, May 28th. They pushed it back 2 days just for the filing deadline. But they kept getting signatures on that Sunday and Monday. And so the decision by the Wisconsin Elections Commission was that they couldn't count the signatures after the 60-day window. Just because the filing deadline was a little bit later didn't mean you could keep collecting signatures. And when they canceled those signatures, they didn't have enough anymore to put on the ballot.
Yeah. Well, the quirky nature of rules and signatures and everything else. And if you want to know more about signatures and how that impacts our political system, you can listen to Frank's recent podcast about presidential elections and the impact of collecting signatures in all 50 states and navigating all of that is quite a challenge. So that happens at the national level and it happens at the very local level. So and there's another school board effort in Wisconsin that only just got underway as well, right up in Milwaukee.
Yes. Yeah. An effort started against 4 of the 9 members there. And that was just in June. So it's still pretty new. They're in the middle of their 60-day window to collect signatures. The effort started after the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction sent a letter on June 6th informing the district that the state was temporarily withholding their June 2024 special education aid payments. And that was a total of almost $17 million. The payments were withheld due to the district being 8 months behind on financial reporting to the state. Democratic Governor Tony Evers also called for 2 audits of the school district after that letter was published. So recall supporters listed the district being in violation of annual reporting requirements, abuse of power and negligence, and unethical and illegal activity as the reasons for recall. At-large Representative Missy Zombor responded to the recall against her by saying that she respects the right to recall and acknowledges the frustration people feel at the situation the district is in. She said she was focused on fixing the district's financial issues. So the signature requirements for that recall vary pretty widely. For, at-large Representative Missy Zombor, she's got 44,177 signatures that would be needed to get the recall against her on the ballot. But the smallest number of recalls is actually in District 1 with only 5,137 signatures. So this is one, depending on how many signatures they're able to get, they might only get a couple of these on the ballot rather than all 4. We'll just see how the signature gathering goes.
And recalls, much like the ballot measures, is such an interesting sort of long-term impact of an election because it's often based on turnout. So the higher the voter turnout in an election, oftentimes that means that down the road, 2 and 4 years later, it could be harder to qualify recalls or ballot measures if they're basing their signature requirements on the turnout. Or conversely, if you have a really low turnout election, what you'll usually see are more recalls and more ballot measures in the subsequent 2 and 4 year period because it's just easier, therefore, to qualify things. Or even some states, voter registration is the barometer that's used. So the more voters who are actually registered, the harder it is to qualify something. So really understanding all of that can be really tricky. And we've got all of that on Ballotpedia, right? All the different rules and requirements. You can just pop on over and Frank will get all of those links in the show notes to navigate and figure out, okay, what are the rules and what are the signature requirements in each of the different states. So personally, that's one of my favorite areas. And you and I have been working on ballot access rules for more than a decade now.
Yep.
It's just one of those fun parts of our system. Mm-hmm. So let's move to DC then. What's going on in DC with their recall efforts?
Yep. Those efforts are still underway as well. So signature gathering phase. Petition filing deadline is August 12th for the recall against Charles Allen. So we'll soon find out in a couple weeks if that makes the ballot. And the other deadline is October 1st. Recall organizers listed crime rates and public safety concerns as reasons for the recall effort. They disagreed with the council members' votes to reduce the police budget and council members' support for proposed updates to the DC criminal code that would have reduced the maximum penalties for some violent crimes. Both council members said that public safety is their top priority. Allen said that there are efforts to recruit and retain police officers and reduce gun violence. And then Nadeau, who's the other counselor, said that there are efforts to provide officers with tools to aid in closing homicide cases and to push the U.S. Attorney General to prosecute more cases.
Has Washington, D.C. seen very many recalls over time, or is this a pretty rare thing? And I really, in the weeds, sort of politically nuanced, I guess, tangent off of that would be that Washington, D.C. is not technically a city, even though, I think to the average person, they think it is. And when you book your flight, it feels like you're flying to a city, no different than flying to New York or Atlanta. But by the law, Washington, D.C. is not an actual city. So in terms of how we classify its recalls, it's slightly different. So anyway, now back to you with the actual question. How common is a DC-based recall?
Yeah, I would say we see one every couple of years. So we do see them. It's not like every year that it's happening. But yeah, I think I want to say like around 2022, we had one as well, give or take a year. So, every couple of years, we'll see one.
Yeah, and over the last few years, I mean, you mentioned earlier that, policing and sort of, reform, sentencing reform, criminal justice, those have been issues that have popped up. And recalls as a sort of manifestation of the sort of national conversation that's taking place.
Yeah, definitely.
So what are some other interesting recalls we have? We've got one in California with Alameda County's DA, speaking of criminal justice. And this is an extension of a sort of mini trend going on with California DA recall. So what are we seeing out there?
Yes. So Alameda County's Pamela Price, she that recall actually did make the ballot. So that's going to be held on November 5th, 2024. And that's 2 years before she was scheduled to be up for election regularly. The recall was organized by the group Save Alameda for Everyone. So the acronym there is SAFE, S-A-F-E. And their website stated, and this is a quote, DA Price is failing us in her responsibility to enforce the law, prosecute criminals, and keep violent offenders off our streets. That's the end of the quote. Price responded to the recall attempt by arguing that the effort was organized by Republican-connected special interest groups. She also advocated for alternatives to incarceration and argued that sentencing enhancements propagate racial disparities.
Now, let's use the Price recall to talk about another little quirk of recalls that I'm always interested by, and that's, in some cases, the recall is simply a yes or no. And if yes, then an election is scheduled for a later date, and you don't even think about who the replacement is going to be. In other cases, there's a process by which, okay, a recall is qualified for the ballot. Now we're going to collect candidate names, and candidates are going to declare. And if yes wins, there's also a simultaneous vote that occurs. So how does this Price recall play out? Is it the first one where it's just a yes or no, or are there actually going to be candidates who are declaring and essentially running candidacies for this election?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. So a few years ago, I would have said definitively, yep, it's a yes, no, and then there's a replacement question. California actually just recently changed the recall laws up a bit, and they got rid of that replacement question in most cases. So I believe this will be just a yes or no, but I'd have to verify that because I believe some counties were able to kind of figure out how they wanted to do it. And this is one of my coworkers is the one covering this, so I'm not completely familiar.
Yeah, that whole yes, no, or are there candidates running it certainly adds to the complexity of recalls for voters to understand and to the complexity of the whole process. So, well, yeah, that's another very interesting one that we'll be covering and monitoring very closely on Ballotpedia. You can read all about it there. So let's kind of like looking ahead. What do you think? What do you see over the next few years in the land of recalls?
Yeah. So, I said earlier, 2021, 2022, 2023, all of our top 3 years of recalls. So I don't think recalls are going to just suddenly plummet. I think they'll probably stay kind of high for a couple of years. But 2024 and 2016 are our top 2 years. And it does make me wonder if people are just more politically engaged in presidential election years. I can't use 2020 data to back that up at all because COVID, made sure everyone's in their houses and they were not out collecting signatures that year. So it was not a normal year. But I'm going to be really interested to see what 2028 shows us, if there's going to be another surge or not.
Yeah, it certainly seems like there are more citizens in states are looking to the recall as a tool to participate in the political process and hold their elected officials accountable. So, well, Abby, this was great. I always love talking recalls with you. And thanks for your time today. And we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about our recall coverage at the link in our show notes. We'll be back next week with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. And I'm Jeff Powlett, and thanks for listening.